What is up, everybody? Mr. Purse here. Welcome to unit number 4. We're doing 1450 to 1750. This is 4.5. This is Europeans and their interconnectedness to North America and the Caribbean. A lot of this video is really going to be trying to draw you into seeing some comparisons, similarities, and possibly some differences between this region and Latin America, bringing it together, try and look at some stuff, go from there. That's what I got. You ready? Let's do this. So here's the deal. Coming into North America and the Caribbean, this is the map of who colonizes what area. So we have Spain, like I mentioned, coming all the way up in the last video, California, Texas, modern day Florida. We have Louisiana, or the French area, which goes up the Mississippi River and all the way over here to Newfoundland. And then we have the 13 American colonies, which are right here on the coast. And then the Caribbean is really kind of split up. We got some Spanish colonies, some French, some British colonies, some Dutch colonies. A little bit of everyone has their hand in the Caribbean area because of the climate. It's good to grow. But what allows the Europeans to conquer this is pretty similar to what we see in Spanish Latin America. We have advantages of gunpowder. We have advantages of diseases that the Native Americans aren't used to. Also, we have many different tribal governments. Unlike with this, there was kind of more of a unifying force in Latin America, and then where people didn't like their Aztec or Incan government. Here we have a lot of different governments throughout this area and a lot less centralized. There are some major, like huge tribal Native American governments like the Iroquois, for example, but for the most part, they're not to the same extent of centralization that we see in Latin America. So it's a little bit even easier for the Europeans to take over and take control. In terms of governance and how the Europeans govern these areas, there's a lot less direct control than we see in Latin America. So in Latin America, you have these viceroys or viceroyals who are appointed. Here in the North American and Caribbean colonies, there's really governors who are appointed by the king of whatever that country is to oversee the rule. But there's many different governors. So for example, in the American, what's going to become known as the United States, there's 13 different colonies, and each of those colonies has their governor overseeing it. So much less centralized control. If this was Spain and Spanish America, there would be one governor or one viceroy over all of this, and we don't see that. So there's a lot more, I don't want to call it independence, but different government structures that exist throughout. They're very similar because they can't go against what the king says, but they really have their own structure. Also, unlike we see a little more incorporation in Latin America of Native Americans. In North America, there's really just an attempt to push them out. In what's modern day United States, there's really an attempt just to kick Native Americans this way. And that's really a theme in American history where we're just going to kind of keep kicking Native Americans this way until we reach deserts. So there's really going to be this attempt to push them out rather than incorporate them into government, into social class structure, into what's going on. So much different than Latin America. Economically, there is going to be mercantilism in North America. The mercantilism is a little less strict than in Spanish Latin America. In Spanish Latin America, one of the themes is like much more direct, strict rule. There is mercantilism in North America and the Caribbean, but they're not really overseeing it as much. It's just not as profitable an area than we see, especially in modern day United States. The Caribbean, a little more so, a little more direct control than we see in North America because it's so profitable for cash crops, sugar, cotton, tobacco. Most Northern European countries, and when I say Northern European, I'm talking about the British, I'm talking about the French, I'm talking about the Dutch. Most of those are going to promote what's called joint stock companies. So you might have heard of like the East India Trade, the British East India Trade Company. That's a joint stock company. Essentially what the King of England says is, we want to trade in India, but I don't want like a million different merchants from Britain going there where I don't have any control over them. So what I'm going to do as the king is I'm going to issue a charter, and I'm basically going to say, I'm going to allow one company to do all the trade in India, or in this case, East India, which is India. And I'm going to allow that one company. You can gather as many investors as you can to invest in your company, all right, and buy shares or pieces of your company. And I will issue a charter saying that you are the only company that's allowed to do business in East India and allowed to trade certain products. So it gives a monopoly to these trade companies issued by the king. Now the king is making a profit off of this because he's taking taxing or getting a certain percentage of everything the East India Company or the joint stock company makes. So that company is going to be shared with the king. The king is happy. He's making money. The joint stock company is happy because they're profitable, and their investors are happy because they are getting a return or money from their investment. So everyone is kind of making out from this, and you're transporting these goods from India to the other areas that are colonies for the Dutch, whether it's for the French or the British. So there's really, and these are just the different trade symbols. You can see there's the Dutch East India Company, there's the Dutch West India, the British East India, et cetera, and they're all kind of scattered throughout in terms of where they are actually going to trade. So in terms of cultural, this is really I mentioned this in the Latin American that we come back to this here. This is probably one of the worst things that human beings have ever done. Now, it's hard when you start ranking horrible things that have ever happened, but this is definitely up there with one of the worst atrocities that human beings have ever committed on others. And this is called chattel slavery. It's just the slavery that you probably envision of treating other human beings as less than human and as property instead. And as I mentioned in the last video, the people from West Africa are going to be enslaved, and they are going to be generally the primary slave traders are going to be the Portuguese. And this comes back to the Pope drawing that line and saying, Spain, you get the west half, Portugal, you get the east half. And part of that east half was Africa to Brazil, basically. So the Portuguese end up being the primary slave traders. They are going to bring West Africans to the Americas on boats, and that ship and that journey is called the Middle Passage. Horrendously awful. High percentage of people are going to die. I think it's something 15 to 20% in some cases. You're going to be on the bottom of the ship, and you can kind of see there's like little lines here. Each of those lines is a symbolic of a different person. You are going to, if you're a slave, you are literally sleeping in a coffin-like area, chained at night, no bathroom, no running water. Food is minimal just to keep you alive and not to make sure you don't have disease. If you do get a disease on the ship or you are sick, you're thrown overboard with rocks tied to you, so you drown and sink to the bottom. If you try and rebel on this ship, you are brutally whipped and beaten and tortured horrendously to give an example to others not to rebel. So before you're even in the Americas, horrendously awful experience. You've been separated from your family, from your loved ones who might not even know where you are because they just think that one morning they woke up and you weren't there anymore because you were captured into slavery. We also see this really like a loss of culture. People who are enslaved lose their identity and lose their culture. So you're brought from West Africa, you lose your name. You are not allowed to speak your native language. You're not allowed to practice your native religion. You lose your sense of history, culture, language. Everything that you've known in West Africa is wiped out. Children, if you do have kids, or some women are going to be brought pregnant and brought to the Americas, if you give birth as a slave, your slaves become property of the owner. Oftentimes they will sell them to other owners, so immediately your child is taken from you. There's a horrible, horrible brutality. One, physically, you can see this is a former slave. One of the few pictures that we have of former slaves, you can see his back is scarred from being whipped and beaten. Women and girls are going to be regularly raped. It's horrendously off. I can't stress that enough. If you try and do anything to rebel against the slave owner, you can be tortured, whipped. There are going to be, if you are in a relationship with another slave, the slave master might show authority over you by brutalizing your significant other in front of you. Just horrendous stuff. So, and also a lot of stereotypes of African Americans, which go into the 60s and probably even to modern day, come at the hands of slave owners. And those stereotypes, unfortunately, persist amongst some racists in the United States today. This system is going to last for 200 plus years. So you could have been brought as a slave in the 1600s, let's say 1630 in the United States. Your descendants are going to be enslaved for the next 230 years. Think about how many generations. We're talking 8 generations of your descendants are going to be enslaved. And then you get your freedom in the 1860s. Hey, congratulations, if you live in the United States, you're free. But we're not going to let you vote or have any power, and we're going to keep you basically subservient for the next 100 years. So now we have 300 plus years where African Americans in this country are treated as less than human, and then eventually get the right to vote and some political power in the 60s, but discrimination economically still persists. So really kind of a horrendous time span there. African culture is going to be blended with some European culture. Food, for example, West Africans bring planting techniques of rice and okra. We have some music, a lot of like drums really are West African in nature. So any music that you listen to that is drum heavy in any way, shape, or form is West African. There's also going to be some blend in religion, which we'll get to in a second. The slaves who experience this are going to rebel. They're not just, there are attempts to it, but it's really hard to organize. You have horrendously awful risk of being killed, tortured, which most people are willing to, one, just survival mode. You have geographic barriers in the South. There's these huge plantations. It's hard to communicate with slaves on other plantations. And then there's also just straight up fear, just being scared to do anything because of the whipping and the torture and the hangings that you see. Even with this, there are 313 documented rebellions over about a 300-year period in the United States. In the Caribbean, there's hundreds more. There is an attempt, and there are insurrections. With this comes the social class structure. North America is much more segregated with their social class structure in terms of basically there's no, unlike Latin America where there was a lot of intermarriage and dating essentially between races, where it became part of the social class structure. That was not accepted in North America. If you were, for example, half European, half African, you were considered 100% African. If you were 1/4 African descendant, you are 100% African according to the U.S. government. It's called the one, for some people call it the one drop of blood. Same thing with Native Americans. We don't see that same social class, race-based structure. Mostly, so also, in terms of racial intermarriage, it's banned in most colonies. The first law was in 1664, and the Supreme Court of the United States did not determine that banning interracial marriage was illegal until 1964. So there was a Supreme Court case in 64 that basically said if you have a law that bans interracial marriage, that's not really legal. So a long time of this kind of racism and segregation of races in the United States, which some say still persists today. Last but not least is religiously. American colonists have much more freedom than in Latin America. Latin America was, you had to be Catholic or else. In North America, there's going to be religious freedom. Most Europeans came to the Americas, voluntary people who came to the Americas, not forced labor. The people who voluntarily came are fleeing, a lot of them are fleeing religious persecution early on. So they set up colonies where there's some degree of religious freedom. So we're going to see, although there is still discrimination, but we see a little more religious freedom. There is some syncretism between West Africa and North American religion, especially Christianity. And one of the primary ways is voodoo or voodoo. And we'll talk more about this in class, but it's a blend of West African voodoo, so traditional West African practices, with some elements of Christianity. And here's an example of the Christian Mary and Jesus. And you can see Mary here has 3 lines across her face, almost like, or 2 lines, almost like a war paint. It's a voodoo imagery. And then this would be a voodoo altar. You can see kind of this carving here, and then a whole bunch of stuff here with the cross in the background. So we do see some syncretism similar to the Cult of Saints in Latin America between religions. Different people interact. They're going to blend stuff together. That's all I got. You got any questions? That's a lot. Write it down. Let me know. I'm out.